In this video, we're going to take a closer look at the dermis, which is right below the epidermis, deep to the epidermis, and superficial to the hypodermis. The dermis has two regions. The very top of the dermis is what's known as the papillary layer. Below that, the majority of the dermis is called the reticular layer. Taking a look at the papillary layer, do you see how the dermis sends these projections up into the epidermis? Those projections are called dermal papillae, and that whole region is named after the dermal papillae. Let's first take a look at the papillary layer of the dermis, and then we'll take a look at the reticular layer of the dermis. Taking a closer look at the superficial portion of the dermis, the papillary layer, we can imagine that as containing the dermal papillae. In other words, everything above the line that I drew. And so these projections are the dermal papillae. And so taking a look at this diagram, we can see, what does the papillary layer contain? And I see two main types of structures. One is a blood supply. That blue-red structure is a capillary bed. The papillary layer of the dermis has a very rich blood supply. And then the other thing that I'm noticing is a nerve supply, so cutaneous sensation. This is what's known as a free nerve ending. Free nerve ending picks up sensation from the skin. And there's another type of nerve ending we might see, which I don't see in this picture, so I'm going to draw it in, which is called a Meissner's corpuscle. And Meissner's corpuscle goes right up into a dermal papilla. It has a knob-like ending, and it's specialized in light touch reception. And so the papillary layer of the dermis basically has a rich blood supply and a rich nerve supply. This is a close-up view of the reticular layer of the dermis. The reticular layer of the dermis making up the majority of the dermis. It's everything between the papillary layer and the hypodermis, which I just drew a boundary for. So the hypodermis is the adipose tissue below the reticular layer. And taking a look at the reticular layer of the dermis, it looks like a lot is there, right? But a lot of this structure that we see is not actually part of the dermis. So I just outlined a gland. Right now I'm showing you this is a hair follicle. Here's another gland. Again, here's a hair follicle. Here are glands coming off of the hair follicle. I see a gland over here. This is a sweat gland. And these glands and hair follicles are just occupying space, if that makes sense, in the dermis. It's not actually tissue of the dermis. It's derived from the epidermis. And so we'll take a look at that second. And so if that makes sense, if understanding that those structures are not technically, from the dermis, they're just occupying space there, what we have left as far as, what is making up the reticular layer of the dermis, we can see a blood supply, a nerve supply. You can see that there's a particular type of specialized nerve ending that's located in the reticular layer. This is called the Pacinian corpuscle. And Pacinian corpuscles are very good at picking up any type of vibration or pressure. It would have to be some type of sensation that makes it down this deep in the dermis to get picked up by the Pacinian corpuscle. And other than that, you have a lot of, like in this pink background area, that's the connective tissue that's making up the reticular layer. That is dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense, irregular connective tissue is densely packed with collagen fibers that are running in all different directions. And so the reticular layer of the dermis is extremely strong when stressed in multiple directions. And even though those collagen fibers are running in all different directions, take a look at this. This is a map of the body that shows you the primary flow of collagen, which is known as a line of cleavage. And so technically a line of cleavage is just less dense areas in between these this flow of collagen. And so the important thing here is that even though the collagen fibers are running in all different directions, there is a primary flow, and that's been mapped out. And the reason that that is important is because if an incision is made against that flow, so here they're showing me that the flow of collagen is running in this direction, incision or injury occurs perpendicular to that, and I can see how that injury might have more trouble closing because it's against the lines of cleavage, compared to this scenario where the incision or the injury is going in line with the lines of cleavage. So the purple lines are the lines of cleavage. That's the flow of collagen. Here I can see incision made, in that same axis, and how much more closed it is. So let's take a look at some of the other structures in the reticular layer of the dermis. Let's specifically look at the glands. I'm going to make a different video to show you the hair follicles and things like nails. But notice that the epidermis, which is shaded orange here, forms an invagination that goes deeper into the dermis. And this is what is meant by a derivative of the epidermis, that technically it's the epidermis that's just penetrating deeper and existing in the dermis. And so the hair follicle and glands are derivatives of the epidermis that exist in the dermis. And so the type of gland that we're seeing that is emptying into a hair follicle is something called the sebaceous gland. And a sebaceous gland releases sebum. Sebum is oil. And so this is an oil gland. Taking a look at how the sebaceous gland looks under the microscope, you can see under the microscope that it still looks like a little pouch or a sac that comes off of the hair follicle. And so this is the sebaceous gland compared to this dark pink area. This is the hair follicle. Okay, so that's the hair follicle, and this is the sebaceous gland leading into the hair follicle. The other type of gland that we see in the reticular layer of the dermis that's derived from the epidermis are sweat glands. And so this is the boundary of the epidermis. And they make this a little more distinct in the picture, but still this duct coming in from the sweat gland is a continuation of epithelial tissue. And the sweat gland itself is made up of epithelial tissue. And so that's a derivative of the epidermis. Sweat glands are known as sudoriferous glands. And there are two different types of sudoriferous glands that we can find in the skin. Let me show you. The most common type of sweat gland or sudoriferous gland is called an eccrine sweat gland. That's what we see here highlighted in blue. Eccrine sweat glands are located all over the body. They have a duct that leads into a coiled tubular gland. And eccrine sweat glands release typical watery sweat that contains water, electrolytes, some antibodies. And then the other type of sweat gland is called an apocrine sweat gland. Apocrine sweat glands, as you can see in this picture, they're highlighting the apocrine sweat gland purple, typically convey their secretion into a hair follicle, even though it's a sweat gland. And the apocrine sweat glands are only found, or they're concentrated, let's say, in the axilla, or the area underneath the arm, and the groin. And so apocrine sweat glands release sweat into the hair follicles found under the arms and in the groin. The sweat that's being released by the apocrine sweat gland is a little bit different consistency than the eccrine sweat. It contains fatty acids and amino acids, and so it's a little bit more viscous, and it's also a little bit more nutritious for bacteria. And so if bacteria feed on that sweat, that's what can create an odor from that sweat gland. I'll mention one other type of gland here, even though I don't have a picture of this, called a ceruminous gland. Ceruminous gland is the gland that produces earwax. Earwax is known as cerumen. And ceruminous glands are variants of the apocrine sweat gland. And of course, the other type of gland that we looked at is a sebaceous gland. A sebaceous gland is an oil gland. Sebaceous glands very typically convey the oil or the sebum onto the surface of the hair through a hair follicle. And sebaceous glands are found all over the body, except where we don't have hair, which, can you remember where that is? That would be the thick skin, the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet.